Yeah, so my artistic practice, I'm a socially engaged artist. I'd say my work is typified less by form and more by process and intention. An artist called Tanya Bruguera said that the place of art is one of questioning and social doubt, of wanting to understand and realise change. So I very much fall in line with her kind of ideologies. I work with different people whose experiences are very heavily influenced by marginalisation, whether it's economic, political, or social, and I co-create platforms for change with people in a very creative way, which lead to a number of outcomes. So it might be film, audio, animation, events, and sometimes structures that are literally about pure agitation and contestation. So yeah, because of my interest in social history, social narrative and social experience, I think that was the main role of my involvement in the More Than Oliver Twist project, exploring historic stories and drawing on you know, endless possibilities, rich possibilities of how to connect that to contemporary experiences in a very relevant, emotively impactful, and hopefully in a way that catalyses social change.
Fab. Thank you very much, Morgan. And Mel, how about you?
Hi everyone, it's really nice to see you all, and yeah, thanks again Megan for organising this morning. So yeah, I am an illustrator, but a very multidisciplinary illustrator, so I also work in sort of lots of different mediums, and my work, I guess, is quite sort of responsive, so I respond to the themes that are being explored or the people that I'm working with to create the projects. In addition to that, I also have a kind of another strand to my work is in teaching as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed working on this project because it sort of brought together lots of the things that I love, and collaborating with Morgan has been great as well. So it's the second project that we've collaborated on to sort of bring together sort of Morgan's fantastic work with the audio work, and working with the volunteers has been really fantastic to be able to sort of bring some of these amazing stories to life.
Fab, thank you. We've got our first question from the floor. Thank you, Belinda. Belinda says, what did you get out of the project, and were there any surprises? As you're on screen. Oh.
No, I was going to say, hi, Belinda. I mean, one of the things we got out of it is meeting people like Belinda, who's an amazing storyteller. So that's my very brief answer.
Mel, do you have anything to add? What was one of the things that you got out of working on More Than Oliver Twist?
I think the same thing, just being able to talk to so many people across the project and finding out about not just the research things that had led to, and also the researchers' backgrounds in kind of how they came to the project as well is so interesting to kind of really hear about the wider context of More Than Oliver Twist, because obviously Morgan and I have come to the project at a relatively late stage after kind of the bulk of the research work has been done. So you know, at the beginning we only really knew about the 6 stories within the brief. So hearing about the wider context of the project, and then kind of it just kept unfolding, all these little stories and nuggets of information, and it's just been really fascinating to get a much broader perspective of not just the project as a whole, but all of the researchers and the teams that have been working so hard to kind of bring all this uncover all this research.
And to just sort of add on to that, I completely agree with Mel. You know, if we think about the contemporary situation, to be undertaking this in the midst of a pandemic, where there's been lots of arguments for a universal basic income, and you know, keeping people on a universal credit structure, and all of the different issues that are involved with those kind of systems of support, to be looking back you know, at a specific window of time where different workhouses were operating very differently, and the situation was very different based on whether you were in a rural or an urban location, whether you were somebody who was kind of labelled as deserving or undeserving, and all of those labels and all of those ways of kind of stratifying and utilising people, which is very problematic. I think has been a very emergent and kind of prescient issue that sort of still overshadows the contemporary. I work with people who are labelled as disabled today, and you know, many of those people have been throughout the pandemic sent do not resuscitate forms. So many of these issues are still very much you know, relevant part of how we organise social care, and we can do a lot better in the present. So I think one of the things I really got out of this project was a huge sense of solidarity with how many people are really invested in exploring these issues in the past, as a way to kind of objectively understand how we've arrived at what we've got today. Yeah, and it's been very, very rich and very, very interesting for that reason.
We've got one now here for Mel. Mel, it's specifically about the illustrations and how you chose the themes and the different objects that you've used within those very, very detailed and beautiful illustrations for each of the 6 lives.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because obviously there's each of the lives that we were exploring, there is just an absolutely huge amount of research in each one, and it was going to be impossible to include everything. And that process, it was quite a sort of organic process. So I probably spent about a month just having those conversations with different people at sites and the volunteers, and just kind of gathering some kind of visual ideas and mood boards around each of the stories. And it sort of gradually over time, I started to kind of think about what were the kind of key sort of most important parts of sort of visual symbols. Some of those came out of conversations with volunteers. I think actually I was sent even a little sketch for one of them. I think Ripon was actually based on a sketch that I was sent from one of the volunteers to create those kind of visual identities, if you like. So I wanted them all to be very different, but to kind of really convey some of the research, but also the stories behind you know, the researchers themselves and how they've come to the project, because some of the things that I've included are maybe only, you know, aren't necessarily facts about the person themselves, but they maybe have kind of come out of conversations with the researchers, like just thinking about examples. I think you know, the Harriet Perkins one, for example, was based on a handkerchief, and that came out of a conversation that I had with Linda about the research, and sort of over time then deciding what to keep in and to take out was also really informed by the audio work. So as alongside starting this process, obviously Morgan was working on the audio pieces, and she was sending me her kind of rough drafts of what was going to be in the audio work, and that really helped me to kind of crystallize what should be within each illustration. So I didn't really finalize the compositions until Morgan had sort of pretty much completed the audio pieces so that it kind of made sense. And I still couldn't include everything that was in the audio, but I tried to include sort of the key pieces as much as possible.
That's fab. So this is more of an abstract one, but it's one of our volunteers sort of reflecting on some of her research and wondering what your thoughts might be, and saying that workhouses deliberately created the impression that they were terrible because they needed to show local ratepayers that they were not making life too easy for the inmates. But however, within the walls of the workhouse, there may have been quite a lot of humanity. From your kind of readings and sort of research for the artistic pieces, does that kind of tally with some of your findings?
I think people's lives are complex, and I think when you delve into the politics of any institution, you're going to find a very intense PR machine at work. And one of the things that came out of the project, which was a very key intention behind using, you know, voices that have applicable, relevant histories, experiences that relate, is to sort of draw out the identity and the complexity of an individual experience, you know, that is often, which is what my work explores, which is often at odds with or in conflict with the demands of an institution. And that's quite an interesting territory, full of contradictions and paradoxes. And I think the workhouses across the country are no exception. I think you see that really palpably. So not only do you see that in the historic narratives, you see instances of real kind of you know, kindness, and for example, Benjamin Newell, you know, it seems from the evidence that was presented to us through the research teams that you know, he was kind of taken under the wing of a shoemaker who really had a personal interest in kind of apprenticing and training and looking after, you know, marginalized young men who could have otherwise fallen through the gaps and training up to be boot finishers. So you see, you know, human stories of connection, and compassion and solidarity and sheer intelligence, which, you know, we try to match with contemporary experiences that also show that there's never a straightforward answer. And I think, you know, obviously that's the point of this project overall, is that people can be caricatured and stereotyped unless you look at those complexities and explore it with integrity.
Fab. So here's another tricky one. Did you notice any differences between the way the 6 workhouses were operating, and how is that shown in your work?
Do you mean operating now, or were operating?
Oh, that's a good one. I think probably it would be better to talk about operating then rather than about operating now.
I mean, I think in terms of the, I think it was always going to be more difficult for us trying to get. We were, you know, we were very lucky that we had the volunteers giving us some fantastic insights into the workhouses in place of us actually being able to physically visit. So we had, Morgan and I had both had some experience of Southall and Grassenhall. We both visited those workhouses, and actually even just in seeing those two, we were quite struck by how different they were. I think in terms of knowing what differences might have existed historically, I don't necessarily think that was really strongly came through in the research that I was doing in terms of looking for the visuals. There was obviously, I was looking a lot for the sort of visual identities of those workhouses and the sort of textures, and that's kind of a lot of the areas that I was trying to delve into. It was clear that there was some kind of local needs that were being met, sort of, you know, some of the people that lived there were, you know, there was kind of a large vagrant community, for example, in Guildford, and some of them had specific identities in that way. But in terms of how they were operating, I think it wasn't necessarily, it didn't seem that they were starkly different to me from the conversations that I had. I don't know if Morgan found any different.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, I was just going to say, I found the kind of, as somebody who's sort of worked in refugee camps, you know, where there are different but maybe some scarily familiar ideas about warehousing people. I found it interesting, for example, speaking to Helen from from Gressenhall, who was talking about on the ground the kind of legal, or not legal, but the kind of political loopholes that you could find. So she was talking about how at Gressenhall, because it's essentially a village context, you know, and there are different things about not being able to work and having to give up your tools, which obviously if you're somebody like a professional carpenter is absurd, because then you're then ensuring that that person is kind of indentured and stuck in that system. On earth they're going to the ground found, you know, to kind of soften the corners of the kind of infrastructure, you know. And I would definitely say, for example, with the situation with people in refugee camps in Greece, when I was working there were many people, myself included, who were kind of working around various kind of political structures, like you are not allowed to work, which is actually against the UNHCR Rights Convention, but you know, finding little loopholes around things. So I think those things continue today, and that's what I found fascinating, is about how you, even though seemingly you have this blanket structure, and even though seemingly it's you know, a kind of uniform, utilitarian, kind of hermetically sealed structure, that even then people were kind of shaving off the edges and softening the edges and finding ways around things. And I think there's a lot more interesting research to be done on that. I think that's really fascinating, and you know, for me, kind of, you know, politically stimulating territory to explore. Yeah.
Yeah, fab. I think we've talked about in some of our training, and definitely in conversations I can see happening in the chat, you know, the way that locally the kind of humanity, I guess, of people working within the structure would find ways to support those, particularly the deserving poor, the deserving poor, the ones who you know, it was felt were there for no reason, you know, for no reason that of their own, kind of thing. Okay, so going back to the exhibition, this is a question about turning the exhibition digital. So originally the project had aimed to create a touring temporary exhibition, a very physical exhibition, and one of the things we were really impressed with when we were deciding which artists to work with was Mel and Morgan's approach, an idea about creating a tent in which to immerse yourself and explore the 6 different lives that had been selected. How did you both feel about the kind of transference to digital, and how do you feel about it now? Obviously it came about as a result of the lockdown and the COVID pandemic situation we still find ourselves in today. How has working digitally been for you?
Shall I go first? I still miss our tent, I have to say. I do feel a bit sad that wasn't ever possible for us to create that, because it was going to be quite a different kind of feeling. However, I think I have to say that having gone down this kind of digital route, I'm quite happy in terms of the exhibition being on what I consider to be now a much wider platform. So I think, you know, widening access to the stories that we're, you know, exploring in the exhibition is something that was not necessarily going to be possible with the physical touring exhibition. So I think in that way, actually, the message is reaching a broader audience can only really be a positive thing. And in practical terms, you know, we did have to adapt things as we went, and that was in some way really interesting, because we were able to sort of work with, you know, work visually with some of the things that were available, and there were things that were not available, you know, in the current, you know, sometimes we couldn't access the catalogues of some sites, or we could only access partial catalogues. So it was really interesting to work within those parameters. I think overall it's been quite a positive thing.
Yeah, That was, yeah, Mel's really comprehensive there. I've just got two sort of brief things. One is just a little story really, that of course, you know, part of the intention behind having a kind of Bender style tent is thinking about you know, something, an object that immediately kind of connotes transience and impermanence, but in a very empowering way. You know, I live in Bristol, and all throughout interestingly again, all throughout the last 6 months, there's lots of conversations that have been happening, because there's a big van dwelling community here. There's a big Roma community here. So there's lots of conversations about housing and residence, and how, you know, community and identity are interconnected with those things, interconnected with human rights. Interestingly, in one of the interviews, so Frankie, who comments on Stephen Barry's life, who is the descendant of Northern Irish workers who settled in Liverpool. You know, in his living history, he can remember people living in digouts, people living in Bender style tents. So interestingly, our tent still features in audio form, and drawn out through lived experience of somebody reflecting on a life, you know, 2 generations previous, with a lot of interconnections. So there's, you know, real food for thought there, I think. And in terms of like Google Arts and Culture, I mean, strategically, that's worked out as a brilliant thing. You know, the Workhouse network should be respected as a body of research teams, as, you know, a really interesting, stimulating, and very relevant kind of conglomeration of very skilled people exploring social history in the past, with a lot of relevant lessons for today. So I think it's incredibly positive that it's on Google Arts and Culture. I think not only in terms of audience reach, but in terms of you know, legitimizing the stories and experiences of these people on a more acknowledged level. So actually, you know, things kind of work out mercurially, but often you know, in a very beneficial way. And that's down to the huge, you know, as Mel said earlier, Mel and I are literally at the end of this incredibly deep, well considered, you know, engagement with the research material, but also, you know, collaborative effort, and with that little communicative bridge at the end of it. But you know, it's a collaboration between everybody involved, and all the people who've reflected on the stories, presented the stories, and been within the research team. So yeah, we're really grateful, and really happy to have collaborated with everybody in the project.
So following on from that then, obviously a lot of your work was working directly with our volunteers, and I know that you both really enjoyed that process, but there must have been barriers and challenges. There must have been difficulties, especially during the first lockdown. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the experience of working with the volunteers has been?
Yeah, I actually thought it was fantastic. I mean, the volunteers have been so fantastically generous with their time and knowledge, and have really, you know, provided us with so much help and support in order to actually to bring these kind of lives to life, and to learn more about the stories and contextualize it within each of the sites as well. So, you know, in Morgan's case, she was speaking with volunteers more primarily about the lives and the stories, but I was also speaking to some people about sites as well, not being able to visit, because that was quite an important aspect for me visually. And I don't necessarily think there were, I mean, obviously there were challenges in that we couldn't visit the sites, because that was going to be ideal. In our original plan, Morgan was going to be visiting each of the sites. I mean, there were challenges that it presented in terms of just very technical things. So I wasn't able to use some photographic things that maybe I might have been able to specific things ourselves. And you know, I had to do a little bit of you know, secondhand research into like getting to know certain sites visually by looking online, and you know, there were knock-on effects with that, but it didn't really matter, because then I decided that the way they were going to be presented through drawing, there weren't then the issues of sort of copyright and not being able to use certain visual material that I could find online. But in terms of actually working with the volunteers, it was only completely positive. You know, everyone was so fantastic and generous and great with fun, you know, have really fantastic ideas about you know, the sorts of things that I was asking, quite weird questions, which were helpful to me in kind of coming up with some ideas about how things were. But everyone was very you know, very generous and kind with their yeah, with the resources that they had available to them.
Yeah, just to add on to that, you know, total agreement with Mel, and obviously Mel's done an amazing job at making visible things that were invisible, and I think again that's really useful for the network, because unlike, you know, some museums that have, of course there are many objects and resources across the Workhouse sites, and there are archives, but perhaps available in a less obvious form than, you know, some other museums, big national museums that spring to mind. So I think in a way Mel's work also kind of puts together a little bit of a visual archive, which is really interesting. And it was very much in my mind, you know, an interesting thing that this project in itself, in, you know, 100 years could become something that would be interesting for historians and researchers. So that sort of sparked, and the huge skill and knowledge that all the volunteers possess, you know, catalysed this idea of having kind of audio archives. So all of the interviews and conversations, some of which are sort of 2 hours long, you know, is now archived, and hopefully somebody can edit me out, because I think it's much more interesting listening to the research material, and also through that process, you know, that it emerged that there's this amazing story, the research story. So each of the researchers have a very brief section that kind of explores how they've got involved in social history, which I also think is a really important and fascinating aspect of the exhibition, that actually it's not a case of people who are artists coming and, you know, slapping their stamp at the end of a project, that actually it's a collaborative endeavour, that all of those skills and all of that knowledge is accredited, and there's scope to kind of develop those avenues further. There's scope to develop, you know, how and empower those research teams even more, which is a really important, I think, unique feature of the Workhouse network. You know, that's such a core value, and that's been done so well. So yeah, that's been really exciting. It's been really interesting to hear how different people have got involved in social research, and sort of share that and encourage more people to get involved.
Fabulous. So our time with Mel and Morgan is running out, but I have one more kind of two-part question to finish on. It's a bit of a tricky one, and it's a little bit of an unfair one as well, but it is what do you think has been your favourite part of working on More Than Oliver Twist? And then the second part is, do you have a favourite inmate, and if so, who and why?
Oh, I think for me, my favourite part of working on the project has been the element of collaboration between everyone that's worked on the project, the volunteers, Megan, Jan, and of course Morgan, to create something together. I've really enjoyed that aspect of the project hugely. It does feel a bit unfair to say, have you got a favourite inmate? I don't really have a favourite inmate, but one thing that I will say, the story that I found for me, touched me the most, perhaps, or I found so sad, was Levi Newham's story. At times I felt quite tearful about his story. I think it was just yeah, there's just aspects of it that are very sad, which yeah, I found that one maybe one of the more poignant ones. But I mean, they're all so fascinating in their own right. So I don't think I have a favourite inmate. As I can't really name a favourite. I like them all equally.
Yeah. Okay. So favourites. Favourite aspect. Of course, the collaboration and learning. I've learned so much. You know, about the kind of origins of social care at a time when actually during the pandemic I was working as a carer, so that's interesting because I always work in different social care structures and in education in a way that is in tandem with my artistic practice. I really enjoyed finding all the different contemporary voices and sharing the historic material and seeing and hearing their reactions, I think is very interesting, and it kind of whets my appetite for how the platform will be received generally, especially with working people, with working communities. I think there is often an assumption that people who don't have formal educational training at a certain level, academic training, will therefore not understand. And I think it will reveal that people have extraordinarily insightful and perceptive responses to the historic material that will in turn kind of reflect back some interesting things on how we can move forward with presenting that material and exploring that material. In terms of my favourite story, I'm with Mel, it's really difficult to pick, but Harriet Perkins's life really touched me, because I think it's talking to Linda, who is the great granddaughter of Harriet Perkins, and to have that very tangible familial connection was very, very moving, and listening to what that meant to the family, and to think about that family research was really very moving. And to then see a photograph of this lady whose life I'd heard all about, and you know, the research volunteers had explored the archives, to then be able to share this photograph of this incredibly strong, resilient, you know, wonderful, impressive woman was very moving, and yeah, and very impactful.
Well, thank you both very much. Your contributions to More Than Oliver Twist have just been absolutely amazing. You've gone above and beyond, and really I think inspired us to want to do more and to find out more and to interpret it to a wider audience. And I thank you for your flexibility and adaptability and collaboration, because like Mel said, it really has been a massive collaboration, and the project is really it's a celebration of all of our efforts, I think, and that's amazing. But we obviously couldn't have done it without our two wonderful artists, Mel and Morgan. So thank you very much.